Hey everyone, I'm John with Roadkill Incorporated. I'm a refurbisher and retro computer collector and seller, and I'm 17 episodes into my series Retro Resale. So, being in that business, people always ask me, what are retro computers worth? What can you sell them for? Well, I've bought and sold thousands at this point, so I thought I'd make a video answering that question. To start, I'll say that in the last 5 to 7 years, retro has absolutely exploded. I'd estimate that as a whole, retro has gone up 2 to 3 times in value since 2018. Although it feels like it's slowed down somewhat in the last year or two, it may just be that inventory has become less available, so there's less activity. Hard to say. Certainly festivals like VCF don't show any sign of slowing down, if that's any indication. So, from a high level, as with any category of vintage material, you could say that the 80-20 rule applies. A few big famous brands have 80% of the value in the retro category, and then the majority of brands and items only total 20%. The main brands, at least in the US, are probably Apple, Commodore, IBM, and Atari. So I'll start with those, and then I'll get into various others that I find interesting. And just to be clear, when I make a price estimate, I'm talking about fully working items. So yeah, obviously Apple, the big one. There's the Apple One, of course, which has infinite value, but frankly, I don't care about it because I'm never going to see one. Then there's the Apple II, where things start to get a little more interesting. There's the original Apple II, then the II Plus, and the IIe, and the IIGS. Not many of the Apple II were made, and tons of them were converted to Apple II Plus and are therefore less valuable. In this video, I show an Apple pickup I made, and I had no idea how good a deal it was at the time. There were 2 original Apple II motherboards, which I sold off too cheap for a couple hundred each. The original Apple II can go anywhere from $700 to several thousand. The II Plus will get you $200 to $300 by itself, and the IIe was far more common than the Plus, so common that you can get a whole system for $200 to $300, even though technically it's a far better computer. The IIGS is a little more interesting, goes in the $200 to $300 range. Oh, and I almost forgot the Apple IIc. It's a great little machine, but it only gets around $200. However, the final version, the IIc Plus, that has a 3.5-inch drive, is very rare and desirable and goes for $600 to $800. So then there's the original Macintosh. It's funny, I see a lot of the original Mac listed super high because people think it's worth thousands, and it would make sense for it to be worth that much, but for some reason it's only worth a couple hundred. And that's true of most of these small form factor all-in-ones. The 2 exceptions are the SE30 and the Color Classic. The SE30 is desirable because it's got an upgraded 68030 processor and it can handle a ton of RAM. I've sold them as high as $1,200, although more commonly around $800. The Color Classic sells in the same range because it's pretty rare and the color screen is just so nice looking. I haven't had a Color Classic in at least 10 years, but I've dealt with a couple dozen SE30s, so that tells you something about relative availability. Okay, it's time to talk about gray PowerBooks. They're starting to get up there in value with good examples in the $400 to $600 range, I'd say. Just look at how amazing and chunky these things are. Who wouldn't want this? The Kanga is worth something because it's the first PowerPC laptop, and there aren't that many of them. Some of the 68040 processor models are worth a fair amount, and some of the Duos, the Color Duo especially, goes for a lot, often above $500 in good shape. Others, in my opinion, have really shoddy designs that I can't imagine would be too collectible, but that's probably just me. The JLPGA PowerBooks go for thousands. These are super rare special editions. Funny story, maybe 10 years ago I got one of these and didn't know what it was, so I peeled off the ugly brown covering. I thought it was totally hideous and still do, and frankly I think I improved it, but I definitely threw away $1,000 in the process. And finally, worthy of note is the PowerBook 2400C. It's hard to tell in the video, but it's a very small computer with smaller keys than usual, a handlebar mustache clicker, and for some reason it has a white screen clasp. This was apparently made for Apple by IBM, and it's worth quite a bit, $600 to $800 range. Next, let's look at the black PowerBooks, Lombard, Pismo, and Wall Street. It's always tricky knowing which is which, but Pismo is the newest and most desirable, and you can tell it's a Pismo by the dual FireWire ports. These are getting into the 3 to 500 range, I would say. I don't think they've fully transitioned to vintage yet, honestly, but I do think they will be worth more in the future. Okay, so colored clamshell iBooks. Definitely worth a lot of money now. Even the common colors go for a few hundred in good condition, but it's the tangerine and especially the lime that are worth the most. They can go in the 1,000 range. 15 years ago, it's funny, recyclers used to offer me pallets of these for scrap value, and I'd turn them down and watch them drill holes through them because no one was buying them. No one would even pay the cost of shipping for one. Think of that. So, on to more PowerBooks. Easily the most valuable of these newer ones is the titanium. This was a lot of people's first 15-inch laptop, so there's nostalgia there. Plus, it's an ideal machine if you need to run a lot of older software. Too bad it's not holding up very well with a floppy hinge and paint coming off everywhere. There's an older VGA model and a DVI model, and the DVI in good shape can get you in the 500 range, and I think that will be going up in the future too. It's worth noting that a working titanium battery goes for 100 or more. Certain accessories in retro you really want to look out for. AC adapters for clamshells and PowerBooks can be very rare and go for $60 as well. Okay, aluminum PowerBooks. We have the 12, 15, and 17-inch. Personally, the 15 and 17 don't do a lot for me. They just remind me of aluminum MacBooks, but the 12-inch is really something special. It just has a unique feel and design. Unfortunately, it's hard to work on and it overheats. Best case, they only go for 200 or so right now, but I predict they will be super popular as they get closer to vintage. Before I get much further in, I should talk about the U-curve. The U-curve is a concept first described in the 1970s in a book called Rubbish Theory, an amazing book. You should really read it if you're interested in how things become vintage. It totally transformed my thinking on the topic. So the U-curve is relevant for all products and lots of other things as well, but obviously we're talking about computers. So at the top, you have new products, and relatively quickly, new products fall down the curve and decrease in value. This is the stage when they're not vintage, they're not collector's items. For example, with computers, people buy a computer because they need a computer to use. It's a tool. So over the years, the value drops down to almost nothing, and the bottom is underwater because that's where stuff drowns. At the bottom of its value, society considers the material useless for its intended function, and its monetary value is literally only what the raw materials like metal and circuit board and screen are worth. So predictably, when it's at the bottom, 99% gets scrapped for the raw materials. And then, on the other side here, once more time has passed and most of the material has been destroyed, if society determines it's still interesting and collectible, and that's a big if because most material still doesn't make it, then certain items might start to become vintage and climb up the left side and increase in value. So instead of being a liability that's dropping in value, it's now an asset and an antique that is increasing in value. So it's a bittersweet thing. There's this process of destruction that leads us to realize value as a vintage item. You might think, well, we should save all of the items from destruction. And I sympathize with that thought, of course, but if all of the items were saved, they would be so common as to not ever become vintage. But also, that tells us that it's saving the items from drowning at the bottom that creates piles of vintage devices that come out the other end. A lot of my bigger purchases are 100 computers that were locked into a barn for decades. You can say the farmer who did that was crazy, and that may be the case, but that kind of thing is the source of a lot of good material because for whatever reason it was saved from drowning. So when I say that something hasn't fully become vintage yet, what I mean is that it's still struggling to crawl out of the water at the bottom of the U-curve. Apple is a pretty safe bet that way. Clamshells are already there, titaniums are mostly there, 12-inch PowerBooks will get there, but 15 and 17-inch PowerBooks might never get there. It's really just hard to say. Speaking of Apple devices that aren't there yet, let's look at the 12 and 14-inch iBook G3 and G4. I have a soft spot for these because when I started refurbishing, I repaired thousands of them, literally. I think they'll become vintage, but right now they're at the absolute bottom, and you can buy a whole box of them for $100. I really think they'll come around, so I'm saving a lot of them. Black and white MacBooks and white unibody might get there eventually, especially black because it's such an oddity, and aluminum Pros might get there someday, especially the 17 because it's just so comically huge, but it's going to be a while. And unibody pros are quickly approaching the very bottom of the U-curve. They aren't very functional as normal computers anymore, and there were so many tens of millions made that an awful lot will have to drown before they have any chance of coming back up the other side. A couple other notable Apple items. The 20th anniversary Mac is so weird and limited edition that it was practically designed to be vintage, so it's worth $2,000 to $3,000. And the G4 Cube is a real novelty and worth $500 to $700. I just wish I'd saved the hundreds of cubes I sold for almost nothing back in the day. I'm not going to get into iPhones and iPods because I've already spent too much time on Apple, but the first-gen iPod and the first-gen iPhone are definitely valuable, and many are in the $300 to $500 range. Beige Macs are not particularly valuable, except I'd say for high-end Quadras, and the Quadra 700, of course, is valuable because it was in the movie Jurassic Park. I sold one for nearly $1,000 a while back. The eMate 300 is the final version of the Apple Newton, and they're surprisingly popular. I've bought dozens in the $50 range and resold them for $200 to $250. They're real tanks, and when you buy them as is, they're almost always working. Commodore was massive in the US in the 80s. They started with the PET, which came in a few varieties, and those can go for $500 to $1,000. Then the low-cost 8-bit Commodores like the VIC-20 and the 64 and the 128. The problem with these computers is that they were cheap to begin with, and Commodore produced millions and millions. So although they are still wildly popular, they just don't get you that much money. A standard VIC-20 is worth about $60. However, an early PET Keys VIC-20, the version that has the PET-style keyboard with the squashed font, can get you several hundred. And the VIC-1001, the Japanese early version of the VIC-20 with kanji PETSCI characters, can get you $1,000. A standard Commodore 64 is worth about $80, and a 64C is maybe $120. It's important to note that virtually every computer I mention is worth multiple times more in a system with monitor, disk drive, and accessories. While the 64 by itself might go for $100, a whole system might get you $500 to $600, so it's worth rounding out the package if you can. The 128 is about double the 64, maybe $200 to $250. The 16 and Plus 4 were failures from the start, and they still don't really have a pulse, although the 16 edges out the Plus 4 and can go for $150 due to being relatively rare. The 64 GS, the game console version of the 64, goes for $1,000 or more, but it's super rare, and I just got plain lucky finding one. So Commodore 8-bit is somewhat of a dud as far as value, but the Amiga is where Commodore really shines. There are many models, and they range in value from about $300 to $5,000. The low-cost Amigas 500 and 600 will get you in the $300 range, and the 2000 averages about $600, but as I've mentioned in many videos, it's an amazing machine because it often comes with piles of boards like accelerators and the video toaster, and the value of the boards can be 2 to 3 times the computer. The Amiga 3000 and 4000 are amazing as well and worth in the $1,500 to $5,000 range depending on several factors, but they're so rare and expensive that I haven't been lucky enough to find one. The Amiga 1000 goes for $200 to $300, but double that if you have the keyboard. The keyboard itself is $200 to $300. There are many, many retro computers where the proprietary keyboard is worth hundreds. Other examples are the Commodore SX64, any Amiga 2000 to 4000 keyboard, and so many others. I almost forgot the Amiga 1200. It's kind of an oddball computer. It's a wedge like the 500 and 600, yet it's more modern with a faster processor and AGA graphics, so it goes surprisingly high, up to $1,200 or so. The best part is I still find them for $300 or $400 occasionally, so when that happens, there's a really good profit margin. The Commodore CD-TV and CD32 can go for $800 range, as they were relatively rare. Accessories for those are super valuable because no one bought them at the time. Most Commodore disk drives cost more to ship than they're even worth, but the 1581 3.5-inch drive for 8-bit Commodores is super desirable and goes for a few hundred. Commodore-specific monitors, and any proprietary CRT monitors really, go in the $200 to $300 range fully working. Like Commodore 8-bit, Atari doesn't get you much, probably due to mass production as well. Atari 400, 600, 800 are perpetually in the $100 to $200 range. The 130XE will get you a little more because it's the highest end. The 1200 is rarer and gets a little more, maybe 300, as does the XEGS, which is sort of styled as a game machine. Things get more interesting with the Atari ST line, but they don't quite rise to the level of the Amiga. 520 and 1040 STs tend to go in the 200 to 300 range. The STE models are newer than the STF models, and they go for a little more. There are higher-end Mega STs and Atari TTs that are rarer and can go for $1,000 or $2,000, but I'm not an expert on those. Check out Greg's channel, The Power of Vintage, if you want to learn more about Atari. But the Atari that is far and away the one to look for is the Falcon 030. This was basically Atari's next-gen computer, but they didn't produce many before they went out of business, and these can go for upwards of $3,000. I got this one for $1,200 5 years ago, and get this, the seller asked if I would mind if they also sent me a Falcon parts machine. I sold that parts machine by itself for $1,500, and at this point, honestly, I wish I'd kept it. That's the problem trying to make money with retro. When the value is clearly going up, why on earth would you sell? I have to admit I'm not a huge IBM collector, so this will be incomplete. I have a couple 5150s, the original IBM PC, but they aren't worth a ton, maybe $500 to $700 for a system. They're full of cards, but they aren't usually anything exciting like with Amigas. On this old of a machine, you need a card to do anything, even to use a mouse or a floppy drive. It's another of those computers where the keyboard can be worth a lot. People love the feel of IBM keyboards for sure. The PC Junior doesn't go for much, maybe $100 by itself. The ThinkPad 701 is worth a ton with the butterfly keyboard. I had one and sold it for about $1,000. Additionally, the PC 110 is a super popular Japanese retro computer that goes for $500 to $700, and it's not hard to see why. They're super cute and small, but also pretty rare, and I've heard they have some issues. Moving on to the less obvious stuff, a favorite category of mine is MSX. The later and more powerful MSX machines can go for upwards of $1,000, but my favorite are the early original MSX computers, and specifically the red ones. Basically, there was a red special edition of many models, and these can go anywhere from $200 to $1,000. Lots of sellers aren't aware that red is valuable, and they let them go too cheap. NeXT computers, Steve Jobs' side project, are very valuable. The N1100 slab can sell for $500, and the NeXT Cube is worth about $1,000, but it's increasingly hard to find. I've never had one of those. Even if you find a NeXT, good luck testing it though, because you'll need the keyboard, monitor, and mouse, and those are really getting expensive. Some of my other favorites are Amstrad, and I love Zenith. And I especially love the Italian company Olivetti, which is basically the Apple computer of the mid-20th century as far as design goes. But these brands all rarely go for more than $300. And in my exploration of the retro landscape, I've bought countless numbers of items for $50 that are really cool, but that are worth probably, well, $50. It goes on, but I can talk about this stuff forever, so I think I'll end it here. That's the thing. However much you think you know about retro, there's always more. You'd think at some point you'd reach the end of retro. Yet after years of exploring what's out there, still practically every single day I discover more. You'd think the 80s was somehow still alive and producing this stuff because it just never ends. So many brands you've never heard of, so many models, so many weird designs. But hey, that's what makes it interesting. When the creativity stops, that's when things get boring. So I, for one, don't really want it to ever end. Thanks for watching.